has any meaning at all. It has a meaning connected to Eddington's enormously ambitious attempt to unify quantum mechanics and cosmology, which was his grand project for a period of 15 years. Started this project in the late 1920s, and when he died in 1944, he was still working on it. He wrote about 25 research papers on this theory, this ongoing program. He wrote a couple of books, and he wrote several more popular and more philosophical works relating to his theory. Well, they have already been mentioned, of course, his famous relativity theory of protons of electrons, 1936. His posthumously published fundamental theory, 1946, edited, as we heard, by Edmund Whittaker. In 1935, he published a book called New Pathways of Science, which gives a fairly detailed but semi-popular account of his ideas of quantum mechanics and cosmology and general relativity. And then in 1939 we have his main philosophical treatise. But we shouldn't forget that Eddington, after all, was a professor of astronomy. And he was famous as an astronomer and as one of the founding fathers of astrophysics, not as a physicist. So why did he come upon these, after all, rather strange ideas about 1930? One might imagine that it's because something enormously exciting happened in those years, and something very exciting did happen in those years, both in fundamental physics, but even more so in cosmology. So one might hypothesize that one of his inspirations was the realization that the universe is in a state of expansion. So I'll just remind you that we have in 1929 Hubble's measurements, the year thereafter 1930, Friedman's and Lemaitre's ideas, their theoretical predictions of the expanding universe are rediscovered, so to speak, and in 1930 the avant-garde of astronomers accept the expanding universe as the new gospel of the universe. And Eddington, of course, was a prime mover in this process, together with Willem de Sitter. But there is no connection between his fundamental theory and cosmology, or at least only very little. So let me remind you that although Dirac's fundamental theory, or the theory of everything, that theory was very unorthodox. But Eddington's views of the universe, his cosmological ideas, were fairly orthodox. In 1930, he made his own version of what is known as the Lemaitre-Eddington model, which is this model. We started in a static Einstein state, which is disturbed by some instability, and then it expands, and so on. And Eddington kept to this model through his life. He wrote his last paper in cosmology in 1944, and he still defends that model. So it was orthodox in the sense that he did not accept the sudden origin of the universe. He did not accept Lemaitre's idea of a primeval atom, or what we will call a Big Bang today. Also, he stuck to the idea that spatially the universe is finite. We live in a curved space, positively curved space, so it's finite. That was the generally accepted idea throughout the 1930s as well. And then, very important in Eddington, but not only to him, the expansion of the universe is governed by a positive cosmological constant. I'll return to that. Of course, we know that after World War II, the cosmological constant became decidedly unpopular, only to become popular again later on, of course. And that in 1931, Einstein had dismissed this constant and said that, well, my earlier introduction of this constant was a mistake. You don't need it. That idea was followed, but not in the 1930s, by most people. So to keep to a cosmological constant was not anything peculiar with Eddington. Willem de Sitter and Lemaitre, Tolman in the US were also very positive favored with regard to such a constant. So, yes?
What's on the axes? What's along the axes?
Oh, sorry. This is the radius of curvature, or the size of the universe, if you want. And this is the time. Yeah, it's a little unusual because it's based on a graph by Willem de Sitter from 1930. One of the first ever of that kind. But as we already heard, and there will be some overlap, I'm afraid, as we already heard, the inspiration came not from cosmology, but it came from quantum mechanics, and more explicitly, it came from Dirac's paper, very early 1928, his famous paper. This almost with the same nomenclature that Dirac wrote this equation is the equation for a free electron, not placed in an electromagnetic field. And as we heard, it took Eddington by surprise, and not only Eddington. This was something very new, and it took some time until people adapted to it. But Eddington thought that Dirac was somehow wrong, nonetheless, because it made no sense, he said, to consider an individual isolated electron. He argued that the mass of an electron an electron only acquires this mass by interaction with all other charges in the universe, so that the Dirac equation should be written in such a way that it necessarily took into account this microcosmic connection, which was a basic feature in Eddington's thinking. And in his first papers in this research program, he dealt with the fine structure constant. As you know, the fine structure constant, which is a pure number, and is a measure of the electromagnetic interaction. Dirac calculated it, and as we have already heard us say, he thought he could calculate that number from principle. He first arrived at 136, and then he added one unit, and he justified that unit in Paris exclusion principle, and from about 1931 until his death, he stuck to 137. The important is not that it's 137, but that it is an integer. I should also point out, and that is a little disturbing by reading Eddington, that when he writes about the fine structure constant, he really means the inverse of what is usually thought of as the fine structure constant. So he writes that the fine structure comes out as 137, which should be translated as 1 over 137. Anyway, Eddington was obsessed by the constants of nature. Of course, the very notion and the importance, the crucial importance of constants of nature is not Eddington's invention at all, but it's fair to say that he was the first one who really emphasized that fundamental physics is all about the constants of nature. So he singled out 7 of these constants, and at least, well, these 7 constants today would be included in any table of modern constants. So there's nothing very unusual in it, except perhaps that Eddington added the cosmological constant as a constant on par with the other constants. Again, that was not widely unusual. Willem de Sitter, for instance, had the very same idea. He also conceived the constant as a constant of nature, just like Planck's constant, for instance. And Eddington, of course, realized that the numerical value of the constants, that is one thing. They evidently depend on the unit system. but that the really, and he called it the truest, that the constants in the truest sense, that is the dimensionless constants. The fine structure constants is one example of it. The ratio of the proton to the mass of the proton to the mass of the electron is another, of the 1837 or thereabout. But then there are also very large constants. I'll come back to one or two of them. So this was pretty much a central idea in Eddington's thinking. Eddington believed, as his work progressed, that he was not only able, that he was able to calculate from pure principle. Actually, he was able to calculate a priori, without any experimental input, the exact values of nature and the ratios between the entering the dimensionless constants, such as he did with the fine structure constant. What was new, but not brand new, to Eddington's thinking was that he associated, that he wrote down equations associating the various constants of nature, some of them being microscopic, some of them being of cosmological significance. When I say that it was not brand new, let's consider one of the well-known and still very important relationships, namely the ratio between the electric attraction between a proton and an electron, divided by the gravitational attraction, E squared over G mm. Saying that the electromagnetic interaction is hugely larger than the gravitational attraction, and it doesn't depend on the distance. It's a figure of the order 10 to the power of 40. That was not new at all. That had been known and pointed out explicitly in the scientific literature as early as 1882. And I believe that Hermann Weyl, whom we have heard about, was the first one in 1919 to relate this huge number to a cosmologically huge number, as given by the radius of curvature in the Einstein universe. But Eddington in the 1930s went on along this line of thinking and wrote up equations which connected the constant nature of a cosmic significance with those associated with atomic physics. As I said, Eddington took for granted that the universe was closed and therefore finite. I don't think he ever seriously discussed the possibility that it could be infinite, although it was not a new idea. I should say that throughout the 1930s, the standard view was that the curvature of the universe is positive. That was the view of de Sitter, of Einstein, of Lemaitre, and many other people. But as early as 1932, we have the well-known Einstein-de Sitter model of the universe, which has a flat space, it's Euclidean, so it's infinite. So the idea that the universe might be infinite was there, and it was mentioned from time to time. Eddington never seriously considered it, and for good reasons, because there was another constant which was very much Eddingtonian, and which he invented, so to speak. And that is what he called the cosmical number, or the cosmological number, which signifies the number of particles, or more specifically the number of electrons, or double that number if you want to include the protons. And, I mean, that number would evidently be infinite if we live in a uniform Euclidean space, but we do not, according to Eddington. So he came up with this number 10 to the power of 79 approximately. Even more in the style of Eddington, he believed, apparently seriously, that he could calculate that number precisely. And in New Pathways of Science, he did give the precise, over 4 or 5 lines, the precise figure. I have calculated how many particles there is in the universe, and that number, according to Eddington, was a kind of constant of nature. It was a number which couldn't have been otherwise. Yes, this table I have taken from a book I wrote a couple of years ago called Higher Speculations, and it gives a comparison between Eddington's calculations of the absolute constants of nature. Most of them are taken from his fundamental theory, with the observations known at about that time. And just a quick glance at it, I mean, it tells us that this is fantastic. How could he do it? A very good agreement between these calculations based on pure theory and then observations. Don't ask me how he did it. Except that in some cases it's quite evident that when his calculated value differed too much from the authorized observational value, then he introduced various revisions in a not very transparent way. But there's one of these numbers which certainly indicates the weakness of this kind of theory. So I want to say just a little about it. That's the Hubble constant. We would say that the Hubble constant is basically an observational quantity. And Eddington calculated it from pure theory. He came up with a value in good agreement with the observed value. There's a large error bar here. And he was quite happy about it. But of course, less than a decade after Eddington's death, there was a major change in the Hubble value when Van der Waal and others realized that Hubble had made a kind of error in estimating the distance to the Andromeda galaxy. So in the early 1950s, that value was halved, 250 maybe in this awkward unity, and it became smaller and smaller. Today we know that it's about 70. So perhaps this calculation was not so good after all. It should also be pointed out in a general way that Eddington's theory, fundamental as he made it to be, was necessarily based on the knowledge of physics by around 1930 when he came up with his idea. And theories of this kind had, I would say necessarily, big troubles with accommodating new discoveries. When Eddington, by 1930, you should recall, all physicists agreed that there are 2 kinds of material elementary particles. There is the electron and there is a proton. That's all. And Eddington thought so as well. I mean, that's why in his book of 1936, Theory of Protons and Electrons, that's the title of it. But by that time, there were many more particles. There was a neutron, 1932. There was a positron. There was a neutrino. By 1936, what we call the muon was discovered. And there were hints we get another mesotron, as they call, and which we today call the pion. And all that, Eddington, for natural reasons, had his problems with accommodating these new empirical discoveries in his system. But he did, and to his own mind he did so satisfactorily, but not to the mind of most other people. Again, very briefly, because that was hinted at in the previous lecture as well. Now, you can see this nice picture of Laplace, but you cannot really read his, the quotation from him, which doesn't really matter because that's the central place in Laplace's work of 1796, Système de la Monde, in which he explains his, what is known as Laplace's demon sometimes, but it's really Laplace's intelligence this all-knowing intelligence, who, if that intelligence or being knows the initial positions, the initial condition of all particles in the universe and the forces which act on this particle, then there will be nothing unknown in the future, and this being will know everything in the past as well. Eddington, I don't know whether he was inspired by Laplace, but he had his own version of Laplace's intelligence, which was no less impressive, but still a bit difference between, because this intelligence is a system who is acquainted with the system, and it should be the system of human thought, which reflects the fundamental idea in Eddington that what we observe about the fundamental features of nature is not something external to us, but something which basically comes from ourselves. He was not the last one to play with this idea of an omniscient being. 2 years later, Paul Dirac, and again, I have no doubt that he was, at least in part, inspired by Eddington, gave the James Scott lecture, in a very interesting lecture, and he has more or less the same idea. Because we heard about Eddington's philosophy, I'll not have more to say about it because we have already heard about it, and I think that some of the quotations are pretty much the same. In the end, what we comprehend about the universe is precisely which we put into the universe to make it comprehensible, and so forth. These ideas of Eddington, his a priorism, his rationalism, and his belief that theory counts much more than observation. Eddington said at some stage, I can't remember where, but he said something to the effect that don't believe in an observation until it has been confirmed by theory. This kind of, this whole philosophy, of course, invited objections by many other physicists. So I want to use 10 minutes on the reception on Eddington's ideas, and perhaps first start with a very instructive, very interesting exchange of arguments under the headline Modern Aristotelians. We have Helge Dinkel, an astrophysicist and philosopher of science, who was important both before and after World War II, who in Nature attacked Eddington very, very strongly. Not only did he attack Eddington because basically the same kind of rationalism which was characteristic for Eddington had been propounded by other physicists, at least according to Dinkel. First of all, Edward Arthur Milne, the brilliant astrophysicist, at the time professor in physics in Oxford, who by 1933 had changed the cosmology and developed his own completely different cosmological system. A system which was, in a sense, was very different from Eddington's. He didn't use or didn't accept general relativity, and there were many differences, but on the methodological level, there were a lot of similarities between Milne and Eddington. And Milne was no less a rationalist, a hardcore rationalist, than was Eddington. And as you may see, no one may not see it, but that is a quotation from Milne. It is possible to derive the laws of dynamics rationally without recourse to experience. Might just as well has been Eddington. Dirac was included among the targets of Dinkel as being one of the new Aristotelians, a rather unfortunate phrase for many reasons, because basically because whatever Aristotle was, he wasn't a rationalist. Nobody has seriously, to my knowledge, considered the relationship between Mill and Eddington in any detail. But there must have been something interesting going on, because basically they ignored each other. Eddington did his best to avoid commenting on Mill's system. One of the very few places where he does it, he dismisses it as perverted from the very start. And so they, in spite of their similarities, and in spite of the distance from Oxford and Cambridge is not that great, they lived in two separate worlds. But the kind of projects they developed were in many ways similar, and so were their disappointments that the large majority of physicists and astronomers simply didn't care. In a letter to Dingle in the very year he died, 1944, Eddington writes that in the case of Einstein and Dirac, people have thought it worthwhile to penetrate the obscurity. I believe that they will understand me right when they have got to do so, when they have penetrated the obscurity. So Eddington very much felt that he was not understood. And Mill thought very much the same. There is a letter from 1943 from Mill to his close friend Chandrasekhar, in which he says pretty much the same. As to the reception of Eddington's system, it must have been a great disappointment to Eddington, because basically it was ignored by the physicists and astronomers. It created some interest among philosophers in England and elsewhere, but most people just thought that it was sort of outlandish. There's a letter in 1929 in which Kragh has just read one of Eddington's first papers, and he writes in that letter that he dismisses the theory as romantic poetry. Let's forget about it. The rejection of Eddington in the community of physicists was not complete. There was one or two differences, and one very interesting one was none other than Erwin Schrödinger, who was himself by that time somewhat had unorthodox ideas with regard to the interpretation of quantum mechanics. But he was very, very enthusiastic about Eddington's theory. He was invited in 1933 to a prestigious conference in Bologna, yes, with all the great peers of quantum mechanics, and he gave a talk in which he defended and explained Eddington's theory. But he, as he says in this letter, he had his trouble convincing them. Will it remain an unhappy love of mine? I hope not. I will not give it up soon. There's nothing in the world of knowledge in this moment that interests me more. He was very seriously, and he tried hard, but after 2 or 3 years, he came to the conclusion that it was not his fault that he didn't understand Eddington's theory.
When was Schrödinger's work on the expanding universe and
that's from about the same time, 38, 39, yes. And there was the only occasion at which Eddington faced the hostility of the orthodox community of quantum physicists, but again an interesting one, and one which is not much known, was a conference in 1938 in Poland. And as you can see from these names, many of the important quantum physicists were there, all of them in favor in one way or the other, what later became known as the Copenhagen interpretation. And Niels Bohr was there himself, and Eddington gave actually a talk in Warsaw with that title, and it was intentionally commented by the other people afterwards. Very, very critical. I mean, in a polite way, but still very critical. Henry Kragh, highly reputed Dutch quantum physicist, says that I just don't understand it when you, Professor Eddington, speaks about quantum theory. It's not our quantum theory. And Niels Bohr, he said pretty much the same. And then the reports say that after Bohr had pointed this out, then Professor Eddington stated that he could not understand the attitude of Professor Bohr. So there has been a complete breakdown of communication. This is incommensurability. But on the other hand, this rejection, this does not mean that Eddington's work was without any influence at all in the physics community. It was limited, and no one, to my knowledge, went into the core of Eddington's theory, tried to develop it. Not to say that no one, of course, collaborated with him. Both in the case of Milne and Eddington, it was one of these rare examples of very ambitious one-man works. In none of the papers that Eddington wrote had any collaborators. At the time, he may have had students, but none of them worked in this project. So there was no Eddingtonian school or anything. It was just his theory. Pretty much the same goes with Milne. But as I said, the impact was not zero. It was limited in various ways. I mentioned Schrödinger, several other important physicists expressed themselves quite, they thought that Eddington's idea were fascinating. That was typical of the phrase they used. They never said that it was true or worthwhile to develop or fascinating. Dirac definitely was inspired in various ways. We have heard from this methodological introduction to this 1931 paper on monopoles, where he says this explicitly. It's also clear from the introduction to his book on the principles of quantum mechanics, and even more so in 1937, when Dirac comes up with the idea of the large number hypothesis. Although Dirac's idea of a varying gravitational constant was very un-Eddingtonian. His reasons for proposing it, the relationship between the very large numbers, was very much in the spirit of Eddington, and he says so. And then there were, well, a dozen at least physicists, not a physicist of the first rank, some of the second, some of the third rank maybe, but they took over the more numerological part of Eddington's theory, because that's easy enough in a certain sense. And they came up with relationships between the natural constants inspired by Eddington, but they didn't really use his theory. That's, I call them cosmonumerologists, which may be the best. One of them was Arthur Haas, a fairly well-known Austrian physicist who did fairly important work in quantum theory in the 1920s, and then immigrated to the US, where he became professor at the Notre Dame. And in that period, he very much cultivated numerology in the Eddingtonian style. He wrote a paper with this in the Physical Review, for instance, a purely theoretical derivation of the mass of the universe, and so on and so on. The last one I want to mention is a person, a very important person, of course, namely Max Born, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, later a Nobel laureate. Max Born, at the time, he lived in England, well, in the UK. He was professor at Edinburgh, I think. Came from Germany, of course. And he was very, very critical towards Eddington. In 1943, he wrote a book called something on theory and experiment in physics, a booklet based on some lecture he gave. And he hits very hard on Eddington, whom he accuses of disregarding observation experiment, and he maintains that physical theory necessarily has to strike a balance between theory and observations and so forth. So he's very critical. On the other hand, he also cultivated some of the same ideas as Eddington. He was more Eddingtonian than he wanted to admit, so to speak. In the late 1930s, he wrote a couple of articles on the mysterious number of 137. In India, he spent nearly the whole year in India at the time, and he gave one of the Indian Academy of Science. As you can see, what he tried to do was to deduce the value of the fine structure carbon purely theoretical. So we evidently saw that this goal of Eddington's was reasonable somehow. And he used a lot of time on it, and then he gave it up. So in the end, at least as far as physics and astronomy is concerned, philosophy may be a different thing. But in the end, the impact of Eddington's grand journey into a theory of everything was close to zero. Thank you.